Successful Implementations, presented by William Tincup, Principal Analyst with Key Interval Research. My name is Carrie Johnson. I'm the Managing Director of the Compose Division of DecuSoft. Compose is a specialized compensation software solution that allows you to simplify the complexities of variable pay administration. Before we wholly dive in, I want to just do a little bit of housekeeping. Although we're keeping phones muted during the presentation itself, we really would like this to be an interactive conversation. So please utilize the question pane over on the right-hand side of your GoToWebinar interface. Ask questions, engage us. Personally, I'm a little bit of a verbal freight train, and William is quite the chatter. So again, go ahead and put those questions in. I'll interrupt or he'll interrupt, and we'll get your questions answered. That being said, I noted already that my name is Carrie Johnson, and I have with me today my friend and colleague, William Tincup. William and I have actually worked together for several years in many iterations. When William and John started Key Interval, I was totally excited, particularly when I saw their research roadmap. William has a unique perspective and depth of knowledge in human resources and specifically leveraging technology that is really second to none. We happen to share a passion for building and maintaining relationships. And I think you'll see today specifically how that passion translates into really gathering, analyzing, and sharing transforming insights. I could go on. As I mentioned, I'm quite the talker. But I'd really rather have you, William, tell us a little bit about yourself and about Key Interval.
Absolutely. Thanks, Carrie. It's obviously I love talking with you, and I'm just happy to be here. Again, I'll reiterate what Carrie said about asking questions. We really want this to be a conversation, and the last thing we want you to do is to get off the call and not have something, a question that you had not answered. I'll try my best to answer it. As for me, good gosh, 46, Virgo, Texan, 2 kids, 2 boys, 9 and 5, 21 years married. I don't know how my wife does it. Just kidding. You know, I think I would tell you I am a lover. I've fallen in love with HR, and it's a love affair that's about 15 years old now. But I just love all the components of HR, and I love speaking to HR audiences. I have a podcast, a daily podcast, where we talk to HR practitioners, and in starting the research firm Key Interval in October of last year at HR Tech, my business partner, John Sumser, who's been in the industry for 20 years, more on the recruiting side, we looked at the narrative of HR, and this is everyone in HR, both in training and compensation and outplacement, etc. So if you look at the whole of HR, most of the narrative is negative. It's really easy to blog negatively or to say something negative about HR, and you know, it wasn't our experience. And the people that we talked with, there's a lot of hero stories, and so you know, one of those kind of aha moments. You can either be a part of the solution and part of the problem, right? We can tell people that there are hero stories at HR, but we needed to do research, and so the fundamental part of why Key Interval came to market was we looked at all of the research that was being done by great firms like Gartner and Aberdeen and Forrester, Brandon Hall, etc. And we think that we truly believe that there are some great hero stories to be told out there, but you got to go out and really do quantitative and qualitative research and talk to people and to find out what's going on, the real practitioner story, what behind the curtain, what happens when HR interacts with technology. And so we're a couple research reports in, and I would tell you in short, I probably personally should have made the move to research at least a decade ago. I've fallen in love with talking with practitioners about what's going on, helping them through kind of gnaw on big ideas. And this particular conversation today is about successful implementations, like how do you orchestrate, how do you manipulate, how do you create successful implementations, and they can be created, they can be manipulated, they can be orchestrated. There are levers to be pulled. We'll go through all of that stuff. But the idea is that we went out and talked to 1,000 practitioners, 40 qualitative interviews, 3 focus groups, and we learned from people like you, the people that are on this call, what's really going on. And when things work, it works because of this or these things. And so I'm excited, if you need credentials, everyone on the call is highly credentialed. Look me up. I'm in Google. I'm very active in social media, but, BA, MA, MBA, SPHR, I could go on, but it really, it's obnoxious. So I won't do that, and I won't go on because everyone on the call is as credentialed as I am. So let's get past all that. And Carrie, I think you have some housekeeping.
I sure do. I want to mention again that you can easily utilize the question pane on your GoToWebinar interface on the right-hand side of the screen. Do not be shy. We certainly want to hear from you. Again, we'll keep phones muted simply because it helps to eliminate feedback, as in the static kind. So with that said, William, why don't we go ahead and dive in? We're excited to see what you have to say. I've seen the research, and it is very cool.
Awesome. So this is me and my partner. So I'm on the right, the purple bearded guy. And again, I want to, the only reason I start here is that I want to be a resource for everyone on the call. So again, a week from now, if you're wrestling with an idea, shoot me an email, tweet to me. If you need to, call me on the phone. And John's the same way. My business partner is the same way. We're extremely accessible, and we're here for practitioners, people doing the day-to-day work. And we work and interact with people all the way from sourcing or recruiting all the way to outplacement, so that entire end-to-end employee life cycle. So if you have a question, not just now, but I want to be a resource for you over time. So there's all of the, pertinence. So back to key interval and why we started this whole bit. We had a bunch of questions. That's, two guys, one an artist, the other an engineer, and we had a lot of questions. And to be a fly on the wall for John and I's 1,000 conversations and how we want to ask questions is a lot of fun and also relatively frustrating. But we needed to collect data, and in collecting data, we discovered some things, of which, as it relates to successful implementations, we'll talk about today. But what that's really done is created more curiosity. And I want to just kind of talk about that. Like, there's no end point. Like successful implementations, we've learned what we've learned this time, and we'll go deeper next year. And so just think of that our questions led to some type of data collection, be it qualitative or quantitative, and we discovered some things, some of which validated things that we already kind of knew about the market, and some of it we totally mystified us. Were not things that we thought of, and of which that just kind of created more curiosity for us. I wanted to start with the elements of the software life cycle. And by and large, if you look at the entire market, there's 22,000 HR recruiting software applications in the world. So if you're ever frustrated, or if you're ever overwhelmed, that maybe you don't know all the technology players, there's kind of a reason for that. I don't, and I've been studying this particular intersection of HR and technology for 15 years of my life. I don't know every single one of them. The conversations that are most often blogged about or at conferences, etc., is around the product. And everyone listening to this call, the product's important. But how you evolve, how you evaluate the products. And what I would tell you is that red part where it says the relationship, we found that the relationship is just as important as the software. And so I want to start off kind of talking about implementations by not talking about software, ironically, because I think a lot of the dialogue that's out there is about features and functionality. And it's almost like an arms race, and you compare this vendor and it's which one has more features. It's not a game of which one to me, and again, I'll be rather opinionated here, it's not a game of who has more features. It's which features will you use, and big giant A and D, and can you get along with the people that are at the software firm? And that's everything from support to billing to, implementations. That's everything. So I want to kind of emphasize that, because it is something that we'll talk a lot about today. Is the relationship you have with software firms is critical, and how you interact with them and how they have your back and you have their back, extremely important. So I will move on from that to the elements of implementation. So we'll spend a little bit of time on this slide, because I think it's important as we make notes to think of how that process starts to play out in your mind. That, when you start with a mission, what are we trying to achieve? If it's something like, let's take compensation as a great example. Let's take, you're moving from Excel into sophisticated software. Compensation software to be. That is a mission. That is a transformational moment, but that is a mission. Getting everyone to understand what that is, why that is, and what it touches, and agreeing on the vista, agreeing on how you see the world, making sure both internally but also as you talk to your vendors, here's the mission, is where you start. Contract. What I would have you note in contracts is you're not as good at contracts as the software vendors. And again, I'm not speaking disparagingly about HR. It's just you don't do it as often as they do. And it's not muscle memory. It's not something you do every single day. And it's one of those things that you want to make sure you understand all the elements of a contract. And it's hard because there's a lot of jargon in there, both legalese and technical language that you might not understand. I'll highlight one thing, and that's data. Making sure that you own your data is critical. I mean, absolutely. I'm not going to say it's important. It's beyond important. It's critical. It doesn't happen as often in total rewards, performance, recognition, or compensation, or even benefits, but it happens a lot in payroll and core HR, where the data, basically the vendors make it hard to switch. So you don't own your historical data. So I really want to emphasize that point, that just make sure if it's co-owned, totally comfortable with that. I don't care if the vendor has a copy of the data. I couldn't care less, as long as we have a copy of our data or can easily get out. So when you go through the contract process, talking to them, talking to your vendor that you've fallen in love with, you get the features, you really like the people. When you get into a contract, what you're really trying to do is understand the elements and understand, okay, if things don't go well, what happens? Like, what's the procedure? How do we effectively terminate? How do we get out? And it's good to talk about those things. It's actually healthy to talk about those things rather than avoiding them and then having feelings afterwards. Go ahead.
William, I'm going to hop in here too. So obviously this is an area that is near and dear to our heart as well, and we truly enter into partnership with our clients. But I will say, from the vendor perspective, the one thing that I always want to say out to our partners in this process is transparency. Be as transparent as possible. Communicate to your vendor partners about your internal processes. Who in procurement and legal will be involved? What are the the table stakes? These must be here elements. All of those things on the table, as you said, open up a really healthy conversation that not only moves the process forward rapidly, but creates a very stable relationship going into implementation. The last thing we want is to get to the table to implement and have had kind of a not so fun process in the contracting phase. So the inform and educate your vendor partners. I would raise my hands to the sky on that. That level of transparency and further developing the relationship is critical.
Yeah, it's like we all avoid conflict. Like even people that are conflict oriented, on some level we avoid conflict. This isn't a conflict. We're getting together. We're agreeing to get together. Let's all understand. Okay, your house, my house, or do we need three cars? Like, let's talk about it. And I agree. There's no gotcha moments. The more transparent on both sides, the better. Which leads me to the third point on this list is the implementation teams. Success happens when you and they can dedicate people to the implementation. So let's just use the example that Sally and Billy are going to be on our team, and it's a 6-month process, and they, not going to work on it full time, but there are dedicated resources. And Jane and John are the implementation specialist for the vendor, and they're going to work on it for 6 months. Where you see failure, ironically, well, not ironically, is in churn, matriculation, promotion, or other types of when people go and do other things. So if you don't dedicate, that's already a recipe for failure. So there's check. If you don't meet your implementation team prior to really doing work, substantive work with one of your vendor partners, there's a potential risk there because chemistry. And some of this is going to sound like common sense, but we backed it up with data, is that if you don't meet them, and you run the risk of not liking them, and if you don't like them, things will fall apart. That will happen because, as you see towards the end, the inevitable disaster always happens. Not so inevitable. So implementations, the bit there is how do you dedicate on both sides, make sure you get all the chemistry, and keep them whole as best you can, and keep that stable through the life of the implementation. And again, when you're dealing with implementations that run months and years, I know how difficult that is, but on some level I question why implementations are months and years, but that's a different issue. Fourth point about management involvement is it goes like this. Making sure that people all the way, we'll take Total Rewards as a great example. Total Rewards touches everything in a company. Everything. There isn't anything that's not touched by Total Rewards. That goes to the board, that goes to the C-suite, it's the values, it's culture, it's engagement, it's everything. So not having their buy-in is actually disingenuous culturally, or ethically or morally. I mean, not having them be aware or educated or understanding of what you're doing. So the last thing you want to do is implement software and them not know or not care about what you're implementing. So it's a high wire act of making sure that they understand what you're doing, but yet not attending all your meetings and calls because they probably have other things to be doing. But so getting them involved, I would at least start with education and awareness and to understand the tentacles of what you're trying to achieve, maybe that project mission, etc. Critical. Implementation project. This is, I think, outside of mission, this is one of the more important parts of how do you manage expectations. So you're managing expectations not just between practitioner and software vendor, but you're also managing expectations of the users of the software, buyers, if there's any other people that are part of the buying process, the executives, etc. So you're managing a lot of expectations, creating a project where we say this, we'll agree to this, we're going to do that by this date. It's a way to document and agree on how you see the world. And Carrie, I know you have some strong feelings here, but for me, it's important for both of that. The word you used earlier, transparency. Yeah. I think an implementation project, that is the game of transparency.
To that end, we've had a great question come up, William, where, do you, through the research or personal experience, or just interaction with practitioners, what are recommendations or what have you seen work when vendors or for a vendor or client to handle a situation when team members are unavailable or become unavailable? Certainly, as a vendor partner, we've experienced practitioners being taken off projects, that type of thing. And in fact, from a DecuSoft perspective, over 12 years, we've siloed the three main reasons things derail. which are availability of data, availability of team, and ability to make decisions, management involvement, as you say. But to the point, what are you seeing working? How do you see, or how did you see the organizations you spoke with kind of cope with?
This is such a great. I'm going to go forward a slide because it'll help.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
what we found in the research, and this is such a great question, so thank you for asking this question, by the way. What we see in the research is real simple. If when you buy software, you take it as a transformational moment. And again, we'll use that Excel to compensation software. That's a moment where you look at your process, you look at your data, you look at who's doing what, you look at your reporting, you look at analytics. You take that moment as a transformational moment. It's not incremental. It's not, we're just trying to optimize this one thing. That success when companies, and this is practitioners, and everyone in the vertical of practitioners, so that's their bosses, the executive suite, whatever, however that plays out in companies, when they take it as a transformational moment, they make time for it. And so this is get back to kind of something, when someone says that they don't have time for you, what they're really saying, without saying it, is that you're less of a priority than the other priorities I have. That's really what's being said. And it's kind of a kick in the stomach, but that's the truth. So when something happens and you take a person off the project, what we've done is deprioritize that project. And we've basically said, without saying, it's not transformational enough for us to put people on it. And so again, if you get back to how do you orchestrate success, you go all in. You make sure it's a transformational moment. And that's why, and that's how you orchestrate success, is you have everyone bought in. And when those, okay, so Sally took a job, in Topeka. Well, you got Randy who's next, who's been running side by side on the project. He can take over. Because it's a transformational moment. You're not gonna just have one person working on it. And so you would have backup. Again, you're going to make time for the things that are important. So, great question. We'll skip over this one, but I do want to go backwards for 2 seconds. Mm-hmm. Training. Okay, so I studied user adoption for 5 years of my life, user adoption of software, which sounds really boring, but that's true. When you look at software adoption, you can get people to use software. Done. Like, I can just send you a list. Here's the things you do. At the end of the day, it becomes a game of training. And for everyone listening on the call, I'm not talking about cookie cutter training. I'm talking about training that, like, take Carrie and I. Carrie and I learn differently. Learning differences, learning styles. We just learn differently. And I don't even know how she learns, and I can say that. We learn differently. So software companies are getting really aggressive about how do we train people, because it's been their best interest that you know how to bend the software. It's in your best interest as practitioners that you can leverage every aspect of the software, like every aspect of the software, and that comes down to training. So again, if you want to orchestrate success, make sure that you're orchestrating training. Okay, so the inevitable disaster. This is where character is born. And at the end of the day, if it's a transformational moment, you're going to have your software providers back, your vendors back, your collaborators back, and they're going to have your back. Because inevitably, one of you, if not both of you, are going to make mistakes. You're going to say, oh, our data's fine, only to find out, yeah, data's not fine. and they're going to miss some calls, or the technology, they went through an iteration. Like, that just happens. That's life. That's every implementation ever. The inevitable disaster happens. It's how do you recover? How do you respond? And knowing that going in and talking about it. Acceptance. Acceptance is usually what people say go live, and I hate the term go live, so I don't use that term that often. But really, this is a mutual. It's where you've agreed, here's when we say it's done is here. And you've got to have that vision before you even start. So again, if it's a project where you've got compensation managers in 14 different countries, they all have to have a certification of their training, then the software is, then we'll say it's go live, or we'll say sign off has happened. I think it's more important to make sure that you see the world the same way. What those things are, every company, every software install, everything's different. It's more important that you see the world the exact same way. The last thing on this list is user satisfaction. So beyond user adoption is the concept that people can actually be happy, dare I say, love the software that they use. And everyone on this call uses software on a daily basis that they love. Be it Instagram, be it Facebook, be it Google, whatever the bit is, there is software on the world that you love. And I believe with all my heart that you can love HR software. And so thinking about people using the software is great, but thinking beyond that moment of how do we get people to fall in love with the software is an even greater, loftier ambition.
Mm-hmm. And then you're moving on, and we had a quick question, William.
Sure.
In regard to sign-off, what have you seen with the folks that you're talking about in regard to the formal acceptance and sign-offs along the project? So you talk about go live, which is kind of the big kahuna moment, right? So typically in writing. But what about the other changes that happen? What about, what are you seeing there?
Yeah, especially in SaaS software, every time we do an iteration change or we make changes in the software or go live, we're excited. As software companies, we're extremely excited. Like, it's a new release. Like, now the problem with a new release is it releases new features, and those features has to be trained. And so I think if you wrap that into your thinking that, okay, we're going to do iteration changes, we're going to have three releases a year or 2 releases a year, releasing those, making sure people know the changes, communicating in advance, and then training them afterwards. And so it's communications, it's change management, it's training. So that deals with the ongoing, but before we start and as we get kicked off in our relationship with each other, it's just agreeing on, at the end of the day, we need to have these people trained. And that's what we're going to consider. Like, I look at the iceberg of software and say, above the waterline, that's what we're going to consider that go live. Because we know below the waterline, things will change and we'll need more out of you. And that's okay. Like, all that stuff below the waterline, is fine. That's in the future. I'll worry about the stuff in the future. But as it relates to seeing the world the exact same way, I think it's just conflict in some ways, but it's communication. It's 2 partners collaborating and saying, okay, we can do this. We can get, all of our employees are going to be in town for this moment. Can we do training here? Like, it's just communicating and agreeing that that's the goal. And never easy. I did want to talk about reference checking for a moment, because in the research, so when you're evaluating vendors, very important to talk to your peer group. Extremely important. Kind of common sense, but ironically, common sense isn't common these days. So talk to your peers about who they're using, who they're having a good experience with, where they're seeing value, where they're seeing returns, etc. What we found in the data is that some people, 20% of the people, go out and do that outside of the vendor, just go do it on their own. And a percentage, 16% of those, go through the vendor and just talk to the people the vendor provide. But the larger part of this is a mixture of where they'll do both. And my suggestion is to do both. Go on LinkedIn, go on Glassdoor, go on Google, go find people, go find your peers. World at Work in Texas Rewards. Find people that are like you and ask them questions about the vendors that they've fallen in love with and where they see the infinite value. So this kind of gets back to the question you just asked, but service level agreements, kind of SLAs, sorry if speaking in jargon, They kind of sound heavy-handed, like as an artist. I don't really like hearing that I've got a gun to my head. But what I'd say is you look at SLAs, make sure they cut both ways. Okay, don't just have a one-direction SLA where we're going to hold the vendor's feet to the fire if they don't do these 5 things. First of all, that's not setting up the relationship in the way that you really want it, because it's a gotcha. If you don't do that, gotcha. And what we found in researching this is some people, 20% use SLAs just alone, nothing else, and about that 22% use just a scope of work. But the larger sum, 58%, use both. They use a combination of language, and in those SLAs, as you see bidirectionally, you see that they cut both ways. We'll get our historical data to the vendor by July 15th. If we don't, then the acceptance date pushes back a month and a half. Like, it cuts both ways, not just one way. So this was interesting data to find out, and Carrie, interrupt as you need to. The baton pass that happens more often than not is that you have a sales team that works in software firms, and then once they sell a deal, contract, then they pass that over to a more sophisticated team that understands project management, probably understands the software better, might even have some industry or practitioner experience, etc. Their ability to stay further in that process infinitely creates more success. So if it's just a raw passover, like, thanks for signing the contract, Becky's going to get in touch with you next Tuesday, less success. If that's, hey, I'm going to be on the first call with you and Becky, I want to go through the contract, I want to make sure we see the world the same ways, you said, we wrote down, you agreed to, blah, 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 better. And if that person stays even further into the process, more success. So it's something to be looking for when you're talking to vendors, like, okay, I get it. I've fallen in love with you, Billy, but are you going to stick with me as we go through this process? Because I know the more that you do that, the more successful this will be.
Right, and I think to your point, the understanding which players are involved throughout the process from the first call, not just through implementation, but then who and what is the support system on the back end is critical here. We have and I think everyone on the call is aware and knows us just a bit, but we have a unique perspective in that we have dedicated teams that follow each of our clients from initial demonstration through the life cycle of the client, a continuum of client care, if you will.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I wish I could claim that as my own. I have to be honest here that is a fantastic phrase that was coined by one of our very talented team members, Anita, and it's true. That's exactly what it is, and it is the fiber of the organization. So I think when you mentioned something very interesting in the reference check, I think one of those questions you ask your peer group. What was the follow-through? Who did you meet in the beginning? Who helped you implement? And what was the experience once implementation was complete? And are those same people available to you at a phone call or an email? And past an SLA, past what's in a contract of a 6-hour response time, a 2-day response time, and let's face it, that stinks. Are your critical team members who know you and know how to get the job done, are they with you the whole time? And it's kind of a lost art, and it's something that Rick Lorenzo, our president, spoke about just yesterday in an interview, that it's a lost art, and that's the one thing, that personal touch, and you're talking about it on both sides here, and I love hearing it. I love hearing that the folks you're talking to as well, that we all want that. We want people to not just bolt. Once the deal's done, we want to know that someone is going to be there for us who understood us in the beginning and who will make sure that things are going to be okay. And I think it's incredibly important.
Because where friction happens is I thought, I believed, I interpreted, when we went to dinner, we talked about, global compensation. I thought, I believed, well, it wasn't in the proposal. So it's all of that stuff that basically, if the salesperson stays with you, then you make sure that you hash out, okay, I remember you saying at dinner something about global compensation. Can we go back through that real quick? Make sure that, now that we've got Kathy on the phone, I want to make sure that we really understand what we're talking about there. Because in the proposal, what we're doing is domestic. So if global is important, let's make sure that we factor that in. The more you do that, the less bumps, the less friction, the less the inevitable, etc. Back to reference checking as notes for everyone on the call, asking people why they initially bought, and second question, why do they continue to buy, are two different great questions, because why someone initially bought, God only knows the answers they get there, but why do you continue to buy is such a great question, because it isn't going to be the same, I promise, and why they continue to write checks to their partners is why you want to consider them in some ways. So getting to some of where friction happens is in change orders, and so we did some research here and actually came back with something that kind of floored John and I, is when change orders happen. So first of all, we're not going to get this perfect. There's no way, no matter how much we talk and no matter what we do, and getting the mission right and getting our plan right, this is the unforeseen. We acquired another firm in the UK and they have 7,000 employees, whatever. So things are going to happen. The unforeseen will happen. But the first thing we do, 38%, is we ask the vendor. So, hey, we just acquired this firm in the UK. They're a mixture of hourly and salary. It looks like this. How does that change what we're doing? And so you get an estimate. The first thing is we thought, when we went into this research, we thought that the second to the last, we thought we paid for that. We thought we'd get a larger response there, right there. Jaded as John and I are, we thought that a lot of people kind of operated from that perspective, and it's not true. The first thing you do is you go to your vendor and you say things have changed, the unforeseen has happened. Okay, now what do we do? And how does both time and money and cost, how does that look? And then the vendor goes away, comes back and says, okay, we can do it this way or this way. Here's the hours. Here's what it looks like. And so Carrie and I wanted to talk about change orders because, it's a part of software. It's a part of the relationship. It's part of collaboration. And it's not an inevitable disaster, which is what John and I kind of initially thought. So Carrie already talked about data. So, big data, big scary data. Turns out data isn't that scary, but getting it from one system or one process or old way into new way, this is what data migration looks like. So 56% of your peer group, they work with a vendor. The vendor has a way, has a process, has a data collection tool, has something that can clean the data, work with the data, a process, folks in another country, whatever the bid is, they work with their vendor. 29% of the people did it themselves, which I'm a little bit shocked at. Spreadsheets equal this same amount of how many people do it themselves, which again, because it's coming out of a CSV file, I can kind of see that one a little bit more, because I think that most people's import tools are pretty sophisticated enough to grab it out of a CSV. Auto import, did it all themselves as a practitioner. The software vendor was the second one. So here's the thing about data migration. We're thinking and talking more about data migration today than we did 3 years ago, because we're starting to see, we're having pressure both internally and externally that we should be giving people better analytics, predictive analytics, forecasting, modeling, etc. And all this is predicated on data. And either you have, I don't think you ever have great data, but that's a personal issue. I think if you can get to a point where you have good enough data, then that's aspirational. But getting to a point where you have good enough data is damn near impossible. So data migration, this is a conversation that happens in the sales process. And that's what's really important here is we're talking about successful implementations. But in order to have successful implementations, you've had to have had a great sales process where you talk, practitioners talk about things that are this important, like, okay, we're sitting on this type of software, we're sitting on Excel, hell, we're doing it with note cards, whatever the bit is. It doesn't matter how or where the data is, talking about it and planning for it critical. And in fact, Carrie said it's one of the top 3 reasons that things derail. So let's see here. Implementation plan, this right here, project schedule, a budget, and estimating both what are the hours, what are the costs. If it's a flat implementation, if the data migration, okay. So we have so much data, it's all in Excel. Not only can we not have the expertise to migrate it, we don't have the time. What does that cost? And talking in that term, or what is the budget, not just the budget for software, but what's the budget for all the things that are around it? If training is not included, which is my preference, then what does it cost? What's training cost? Because we know that training creates successful implementations. So what does that cost? And the more you talk about this stuff, both in the sales process, but also as you create your implementation plan, the better. Project scope, we've talked through that. Work assignments, this is now really tactical and granular of who's doing what, when, where, why, and a collective Vista view from everyone. Risk and risk mitigation, I put that on there only from the standpoint of, understanding if things don't go well or not to where we want them, what is the risk? So we're working in Excel right now, and we understand how to bend it, and it works. And yeah, it's problematic on so many levels, but at least there's the known versus the unknown. What is that risk? And coming to grips emotionally with the risk that you're undertaking with any software implementation. And migrating over to doing a quick time check, 144. Okay. Why projects go off track? This was yet something else John and I found fascinating, and kind of it wasn't what we expected. It never happened. Almost a third, a little bit more than a third of the people that responded said, yeah, our projects, they went well. Thanks. And I think that's the story, again, getting back to that hero story stuff that I was talking about at the beginning. That's not talked about. When you go to SHRM, or you go to HR Tech or HR Tech Europe, or pick a conference anywhere, we don't talk like that as an industry. Now, this is consultants and analysts and vendors and practitioners. We don't say that, and I don't know why, but I was really happy to be kind of kicked in the head with, yeah, our implementations were pretty awesome. We worked with a great vendor. We communicated. They trained us. Like, I bring that up, and I wanted to put that in front of you, is that things are more positive than you think. Like, if you think of the narrative of any national newscast, be it Fox or MSN or whatever, it's very negative. It's about 80% negative. There's a hurricane, some earthquake, mudslides, locusts, somebody got killed, marital infidelity, fraud, government spied on you, somebody lost, etc. And, some kid won the spelling bee. Done. That's the national news. Yet that's not our daily lives. So the narrative that's told of HR is predominantly negative, yet when we go and do research and talk to practitioners, it's not quite that negative. So, I just want to kind of reinforce that, if you do have a bad implementation from time to time, that's okay, but a third of your peers, they don't think things go off track. And I think a lot of that comes down to communication and expectation management. So the next 2 slides are the implementation checklist. And these are the things that just pin up to the, on the wall, making sure that you go through these with any implementation, be it recruiting software, core HR, payroll, compensation software, performance management software, whatever the bit is making sure you go through this. Project mission, contract, making sure that your implementation team, is dedicated on both sides, and you've worked out chemistry, and you've worked out, hey, we're going to have each other's back when the inevitable happens. Management involvement, communication, awareness, education, etc. Having a great implementation project. If you can do it in project management software, great. If you do it with note cards, great. But having a project whereas everyone understands the steps, and that's the real key to the implementation project, and making sure that everyone says, take that data migration, okay, we're going to do data migration, we're going to do it ourselves, we're going to have that done by August 1st. And all of a sudden Sally leaves or Jimmy leaves or whatever the bid is, and we deprioritize, and the migration doesn't happen. We get the vendor the data 3 months later. And this happens more often than I care to admit. We get the vendor the data, the migration happens 3 months later, yet we still hold the vendor to a go-live date or an acceptance date that's, February 1st, that was predicated on a data migration of August 1st. And so everyone's got to understand the ramifications of everything that both happens and doesn't happen. And that's why having both the project plan and getting everyone to see it and understand it and believe in it is critical.
And don't you think that if the implementation plan or project had a tagline, it would be fair and reasonable yields fair and reasonable? We will all enter into this as fair and reasonable people.
That's great.
And we will maintain a fair and reasonable outlook on, and it's tough because the pressure, as you know, is intense, particularly for you as practitioners. You still have your day jobs, and William, you've mentioned this. I mean, but the pressure to perform and ensure that timeline, regardless of what happens, is maintained is huge. But It is that, I always kind of think of it as long as we maintain a sense of fair and reasonable, everyone will be okay.
Yep.
No one will be lost on the island.
As you well know, I ran an ad agency for years, and if ever a client called me and said, hey, Will, I was looking at our contract, that was the moment that I knew I was about to be fired.
That is a bad scene. So again, that communication, as you said,
yeah.
and I mentioned that because I think that is something that on both sides of the fence, you enter into this and your vendor partners become a part of your team. There is very little separation at that time. And so, it's that maintaining of a cool, calm thought process, but that pointing back to the plan and gaining agreement, maintaining agreement on the plan is so huge. It's
when you negotiate, at the end of the day, when you negotiate, you should negotiate with the goal of being fair. That the idea, the construct of win-win is not lofty. It's not something that's, an outlier. That's actually should be the goal. Implementations are where two parties are coming together saying, we've fallen in love with your software. We believe that it's actually going to make our business better. We want to work with you, and that's got to be met with that fair and reasonable as well. And, we all have hiccups. We all, the inevitables happen, but it's how you recover from it, how you communicate, and how you what your character is of how you take care of the person, when those things happen. The second part of the checklist, again, we've been through these, but I want to make sure that we kind of training. William Tincup comment, all he talks about is training, because I really believe the more you train, I haven't seen a diminished return of training. Okay, and I've studied this really, really hard with a lot of vendors. I haven't found a diminished return of training. The more you know, the more you'll bend the software, the more value, the more you can align it with the company's interest and values and everything else. The more you're trained, the more better. And again, that's many different ways to training. Sometimes that's one-on-one, sometimes that's group, it could be webinar, they could hand you a manual. Like, I'm okay with the training being delivered in a lot of different ways, but it's got to fit you. It's got to fit every person like a glove. the inevitable disaster. We've talked enough about that. We don't have to talk about that anymore. Acceptance. We're going to go ahead and say go live again. I'll vomit a little bit in my mouth, but the idea that you see that the exact same way is critical. And thinking beyond user adoption. It's not just a game of making the software pretty. It's not just a game of, thinking about the procession of software and features and functionality. It's how do you get people to love it? How do you get people to a point where they can't wait to log in and use the software? That's software that they love, that it's assumptive that they use it. And a couple things. So we got a couple minutes left, and I wanted to leave a few minutes, but I did put both my contact data, that's my cell phone, and that is my email address, and that is Carrie's, both cell phone and email address as well. And I want to be a resource for you. I want to be there in case you have questions, both now and as you have questions, and I know Carrie does as well.
We do have several questions, and before I start kind of in that last bit, so before I go into that, though, I want to let our folks know who are on the line with us. William has made a very generous offer for us to be able to send out the actual successful implementations full report to you post-presentation. So you will actually have the full report with the data and the full findings, which is fantastic, and thank you for doing that. It's huge. I know many of you engage in actively purchasing research and understand that the value of that is significant. I'm thinking it's over $2,000 for the report, so thank you for doing that. Also, we want to note that the folks that were on the call today, we'll do a quick drawing afterward from the attendee base, and one of you will receive 2 full hours with William consulting time with him. So we'll go ahead and announce that after the presentation via email. So I wanted to go ahead and state that for anyone who might need to drop off. I've gotten great questions from our attendees. William, if you're ready, I'll fire them out.
Let's go. Let's do it.
So how do you best handle scope creep when there's no additional budget? So kind of what did you see as best practices during the conversation with the folks that you encountered in the research? How did they handle scope creep? Or how did they handle budget? Because that's tough. Particularly if it's a fixed bid, that's tough.
Oh, it's on both sides too, because again, the more a vendor gets in there and discovers things that they weren't aware of, that's unforeseen for them, then they see, oh my God, we need to also do this, but that's going to take 100 hours, and even at a rate of $80 an hour, it's still going to cost money. It's the car buying experience. I mean, at the end of the day, when you go and you buy your car, like I have a Mini, you buy the things, everything that's important, and there's always something that oh my God, why did I do that? I wish I would have done this, and it's the last minute. If it's something you can fight for, again, even in fixed budgets, when we know, well, we don't have any more money, if you believe it's critical to the success of that transformational moment, go fight for it. You've got money, it's just allocated to something else. So on the practitioner side, it's never all gone, because even if you have to use your own political capital and walk into the CFO's office or the CHRO's office, hell, the CEO's office, and say, okay, here's what we got. We went into this because we acquired the firm, it changed that, and I need an additional $40,000. And there's no other way. I got nowhere else I can take it out of. I need that. And if you believe in it, you'll go get it. And on the vendor side, when they see things that are outside of the scope, the faster they communicate that, the more transparent that they are, the better for everybody. No gotcha. Do not get into the gotcha game on both sides. I mean, I've seen practitioners that play the gotcha game, and I've seen vendors that play the gotcha game. So it's, this is one of those deals. Don't do that. That's not transformational.
We try to avoid that at all costs, actually. It's painful.
Yeah.
It's very painful. Training, you're very passionate about it, and I think you'll find our organization is as well. And I would venture a guess, if we were sitting in a room with all of our attendees, hands would be raised here. That's huge. So when we talk about training, and the question is, training at all costs. Should be expensive, like retraining new clients, or excuse me, new team members. So let's say there's inevitable churn and there's an ongoing cost. Are you seeing that kind of absorbed by the practitioners in retraining new folks internally on the software, or engaging their vendors? What kind of practices were you seeing there?
Well,
and were you seeing that as kind of a change order billable expense or not?
Again, you waving my hands and spending people's money is part of my job, right? So first thing you do is you set yourself up for some redundancy within the organization. So I always use the global payroll example of, like, you have 3 global payroll managers and all 3 of them are in, New Jersey. If something happens in New Jersey, you can't do global payroll. You might want to have someone in Puerto Rico also cross-trained on the global payroll. So one level, you want to have some redundancy. And this is just kind of succession 101, don't have all your eggs in one basket or one person. They can't leverage you and hold it over your head. But also it creates where even if you do a train the trainer model, where you have somebody internally that knows the software so well that they can train some people as they onboard new folks. The other is as I point the gun towards to vendors, it isn't additional cost. It isn't an additional change order, because that's retention. At the end of the day, there's churn that happens in software, regrettable churn, where someone moves from a software to another software because they just fell out of love with the software or the team. And that regrettable churn is called regrettable churn for a reason. These are customers that we love, that loved us at one point or enough to purchase from us and work with us, and they chose to go somewhere else. And so what can we do to mitigate that? Well, we can train them, and we can continue to train them when new instances go live. When they have new employees, I look at that. Again, I'm waving Rick's money in the air and burning it. But when I look at that and say to myself, here's yet another opportunity to create a raving fan, to create someone that loves our software. I don't look at that as a burden as much as an opportunity of creating a new winning relationship with a new person, with a new user.
No, that's a fantastic point. It's another level of that kind of high touch service. So this one is more. It's a very pointed question. In a 2013 interview, you discussed learning coding in order to get to know how data works. Have you changed your thinking on this in 2015?
When you're a writer, and John's an eloquent writer. I am a writer at gunpoint. When you're a writer, there's a jump the shark moment when you reference your own writing, so I'm glad someone else references it. I believe statistics and coding and understanding the zeros and ones are critical to the future of HR. Critical, like our curricula should change. SHRM, be it World at Work, every national organization that we have out there, we should be pushing more of a STEM agenda, science, technology, engineering, and math, because at the end of the day, the more you know about how technology, and in specifically coding and data and statistics, the better. And I think the more successful, so then analytics, reporting, big data, none of those things are terrifying. Like right now, a lot of that stuff's terrifying to practitioners because we don't come from a math or science background. And so it's just that you and I have witnessed this transformation as marketers 15 years ago. 15 years ago, you could walk into an ad agency and they were smoking cloves and they had berets and we were talking about art. Now most of marketing is done in a spreadsheet. And so that transformation, do I still believe that? Yeah, I still believe that.
No, but it's a fantastic question. I have a couple of more. I'm looking at the time, so we'll go ahead and maybe take one more. And then again, to point out the fact that we'll be sending out the information to everyone who has attended. So please feel free to reach out to William or myself with additional questions, we're happy to either just answer them via email or hop on a call with you at any point in time. One of the other questions, and I think this really relates to that 34% of successful implementations are happy, things didn't go awry. How did you see a trend in how those folks brought all the right people to the table? Specifically, how did they get there, people who actually knew the data, the HRIS folks, the data folks, along with our compensation practitioners or other practitioners at the table? Did you see a trend in how they accomplished that?
Yeah, communications. And ironically, large companies, 5,000 employees and above are better. And we also saw some industries that were better. And I can, if someone will email me, I can get them the data out of Qualtrics. But it all comes down to communication. So data, it sounds scary. But at the end of the day, that's not an IT thing. It's not an HRIS thing. It's not. It comes down to how do we communicate as practitioners? How do we communicate with vendors? Here's what we believe. Here's what we know. When you look at the data, what do you see? It's all communications. It's like the cornerstone of a great marriage is communications. There's a couple others: trust, respect. But communication. It all came down to, and kidding aside, it all came down to communications. That 34% can be mapped directly to communications on both sides, both collaborators, great communicators.
Fantastic. All right. So, folks, are there any outstanding questions? Please feel free to shoot them to me. It doesn't appear to be. So what we will do, William, we'll go ahead and we'll close the webcast down. But again, look for an email tomorrow that will include a link to the presentation itself, the presentation with contact information, and of course a copy of the research. And William, thank you so much for the insights. Always fun talking with you.
Thank you.
And diving into the numbers as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carrie.